Well, everyone, it's almost 9. So we're going to get started here in a moment. Looks like we have about 50 or so people that are joining in. So glad you're hanging out today. It should be fun. This is kind of the first time we've done something like this. So just to kind of set it up, we usually do a decent amount of rule seminars in the spring. The CGA does with either myself or our staff or our volunteers. We'll give a lot of seminars. We're simply just not going to do that this spring, for obvious reasons with COVID. So, we still wanted to have a rules component to, the beginning of the year like we always do. And, as everyone's kind of transformed, whether you're in the workforce or not, a lot of everything is on Zoom or just any online platform. So we just wanted to adapt to that. So this is kind of an idea I had just to, again, do that continued learning with also being safe. And we're, just as a disclaimer, we are going to record this. So if somebody wants to watch it, that can't be here at 9 o'clock Mountain Time, they can watch it later. And it's not appointment viewing. If you miss one and you want to go back and watch it, you don't have to be at your computer. We are going to do it, again, live every Monday from 9 to 10, and it's about an hour. And again, the idea is each week we're going to cover a rule and pretty in depth for about an hour. And at the end, we'll have a Q&A. So that's kind of how we'd like to keep the format there, is to have questions kind of wait till the end. We've got a lot of slides here, and it's essentially a PowerPoint that I'm annotating the rules as we go. And I think you'll get the handle of the format here soon. But if we have a lot of question breaks, we won't get through all of our material. So I want to make sure we get through it. That being said, at the end, if there's a question you have, I'm going to stick around. I'm not going anywhere. We can do a Q&A about this. If it's a rule that is just nothing to do with this, that's fine too. You just have a question, we can do that. If it's something you saw over the weekend, like, hey, I'm on tour, I want to talk about this, that's cool. We can do that. So I'll be here, when we're done. So for questions, if you would, what we're going to try to do just to keep this succinct is just write them down as you go, so you don't forget about it. A lot of times this happens so much when we have these seminars, someone will have a question. It's like, well, I'm going to get to that in like 5 slides, so we're going to cover it. So that might happen. So if you have a question, write it down. I might answer it. If I don't, we'll answer it at the end. And also the chat feature is there, so you can type your questions into the chat. Ashley will be monitoring those. So we'll have a break maybe, and Ashley will say, well, here's one you didn't answer. That might be a good one to clear up or provide some more clarification on. But that's the idea. So, hopefully just want to have fun and to everyone that I know out there, that works with our CGA staff as volunteers, glad to see you all. And if we don't know you, that's totally fine. This is not confined to the CGA network. We have some people that are nothing to do with the CGA and maybe don't even live in Colorado that are here. And that's great. This is not meant for any one specific group of people, just anybody who wants to learn the rules. And again, week by week, we're going to cover them. We're going to cover about 11 rules, and I've kind of selected what I've kind of called the playing rules. We're not going to get into the boutique ones that are really complicated and convoluted that don't really happen that much. We're going to try to do the ones that are ones that you see with and operate with every day. So it's just meant to be fun. As we go, we'll have those questions again. But again, thank you all for coming out. We're going to get started now. I'm just going to start going through it. Again, kind of the format of this is it's not necessarily a presentation, because when we look at dissecting a rule, we're really going to dissect it and really going to dive into and kind of peel apart, the layers on the rule. So really, it's a lot of screenshots of the rule itself. So if you're a visual learner, when you see these slides, I think, it's going to match up to exactly what the book looks like. And I'm going to have some notes in there and just kind of talk through it about how I see the rule functioning, and hopefully that helps. And again, if something we make adjustments on week by week, it might be a little different. Sometimes we might do more videos and do more pictures and do more text. It depends on the rule. So again, thank you all for being here, and we're gonna go get started. We're covering Rule 8 today. This is our first one, and the reason we're covering Rule 8 is because it's really a cornerstone for the rules of golf. It's course played as it is found. It is the most basic premise of when you study the rules. It's what a lot of other rules are found on. If you know one rule, it should be Rule 8. That is the basic principle of the rules, and it's the 8th rule because there's rules in front of it that they kind of lead up to it, but this is really the fundamental rule. This is everyone's favorite rule, when it comes to, this right here, right? Everyone loves finding their ball in a divot in the middle of the fairway, and every time the rules have a redo and they're modernized or they have a talk about it, everyone always says, "Oh, are they going to make this section GUR?" Answer is no. That's never going to happen. This is such a basic premise: is you play the course as you find it, and we're going to talk about why. A lot of people, again, they just so disagree that, oh, I hit a perfect drive 250 down the fairway, and now I'm in a divot in the middle of the fairway. That's not fair. Fair and unfair don't have really anything to do with it. It's just the way it is. So in the same way that we maybe complain about a ball in a divot in the middle of the fairway, well, conversely, on the picture on the right, that's a ball in the rough that's in a really good lie. So in the same way that we accept or complain about a bad lie in the fairway, we accept, oh, well, that's a good lie in the rough. That's just fortuitous. That's just the way it is, and that's not going to change. And that's part of the challenge of playing the game. You hit your ball into a situation, and you got to deal with it. Some of the best shots you might see on TV are that way because the player did hit out of a divot or had to hit a difficult situation, and that's part of the fun of it. So for me, I love this rule because it is the cornerstone and the building blocks and the general principle for a lot of other rules. And again, everyone always loves to talk about the divots in the fairway, and I get asked about that a lot, just in general. And I would never change it. It's very important to the rules. Before we get into Rule 8, just a real quick aside and something I want to cover quickly that I think is very valuable is looking at the 5 areas of the courses, because when we look at the rules in this continuing series, one of the key things is, where does your ball lie on the golf course, right? So this is Rule 2. So we're going to take a quick step back and jump right back into Rule 8. But we've got 5 areas of the course, and they're outlined in Rule 2. This picture here, good addition to the 2019 rules. They have pictures in the rule book now that help with defining it. This one's not necessarily in the book itself, but it's a good online tool that they have. So the first area of the course, and these first 4 are what we call the specific areas of the course, right? And we'll review those. But the first one is the teeing area, right? And it's the teeing area for the hole you're playing. So if we're playing the 6th hole here, it's the teeing area for the 6th hole. That is a specific area of the course. That's one. The second is bunkers. We all know what bunkers are. I don't know if we need to elaborate on those. That is a specific area of the course. The third is these penalty areas, and as you can see there, the one by the green, that's a pond. We know what that is. And this is a really interesting situation in which the rules and the vocabulary had to change with the modernization. So, now at the top here, that circle of woods, that can be a penalty area. The committee can say this is a penalty area. So in the old rules, it used to say those are water hazards. Well, very obviously that top area there is not a water hazard. So the rules had to say, well, we have to call these penalty areas because it doesn't just include water now. It used to be, okay, water only, and now it's adapted to say, well, this area of thick brush here, we can make a penalty area. So the rules have said, well, we have to change from water hazard. The next one is the putting green. And similar to how the teeing area is the teeing area of the hole you're playing, the putting green, it's the putting green for the hole you are currently playing. So again, if we're playing the 6th hole here, the specific area, of course, is the putting green, the 6th putting green. And those are the 4 specific areas of the course. So the last is kind of a catch-all of miscellaneous things where it's the general area, meaning if it's not one of those specific areas of the course, it would be the ball is in the general area. And this is really, the key to this is where the ball lies. That's what we're trying to kind of establish here. So the ball always lies in one of these 5 places. It can never lie in 2 places. It's always treated as lying in one area of the course, and the rules apply that way. We're going to find out later. I mean, and that's important because, if a player said, hey, can I ground my club behind my ball? I say, well, it depends what area of the course you're in. We know that if you're in a bunker, you can't ground your club, and we're going to look at that. And I'd say no, but any other area of the course, you can certainly ground your club. So it's very important to apply the rules to know what area of the course the ball is lying in. So the general area, all fairways, rough, wooded areas, areas of tall and maintained grass, and the natural sandy areas. Just some examples of what is in the general area. So not a specific area of the course. Again, not the general area. These are the specific areas of the course. And again, to highlight what we said, the teeing area and the putting green of the hole you're playing. Therefore, all other teeing areas and all other putting greens don't fit in any of those, so those are in the general area, and the rules apply the rules apply differently there. So the putting green and the teeing area. It's important to know. So that's all we've got on the areas of the course. And again, just a real quick aside on that, just so when we talk about this, I'll kind of hint back to this, and it's just really important to start off with any rules talk about what, the areas of the course and where your ball is. Where are you on the game board? Ed Made, our executive director, whenever he does rule seminars, that's kind of what he says, and it's a really good analogy for it. Where are you on the game board? That's how you apply the rules. So, all right, we're going to jump right into Rule 8, and what we're going to cover today. We're going to cover 8.1, which is players' actions that improve conditions affecting the stroke. 8.2, the player's deliberate actions to alter other physical conditions to affect the player's own ball at rest or stroke to be made. And finally, 8.3, which is players' deliberate actions to alter physical conditions to affect another player's ball at rest or stroke to be made. So about 90% of what we're going to talk about today is going to be in 8.1. That's where most of the rules, that is really the key one. 8.2 and 8.3 kind of hinge off of 8.1. So if you were to read it backwards, it wouldn't make as much sense. You got to kind of know the premises of Rule 8.1, and those can help apply to 8.2 and 8.3. 8.1 is what we're going to spend the most time on today. That's really the meat of it. That's the key part of it. So the first thing we're going to look at when you're looking at your rule book, and again, this is copied right out of the rule book, so I just really want to break it down step by step. And real quick here, these are brand new. These purpose statements. They weren't in the rules before 2019. They're really interesting in that there's nothing terribly rule making in the purpose statements. Rather, they're just kind of a thesis statement. If you were to take Rule 8, 8.1, 2, and 3, and say, sum it up in 6 lines here, that would be the purpose statement. And sometimes it gives you guidance to help you kind of apply the rules. And it's kind of a North Star, but these are really good additions, to the rules. And, sometimes we gloss over them because, again, they're not rule making. So I encourage you, if you're reading the rules and studying the rules, always start off with a purpose statement because it's a really good intro to the rule about what we're going to be talking about here or what the rule covers. And simply, I'm just going to read along with it, but Rule 8 covers a central principle of the game, like I said earlier, to play the course as you find it. When the player's ball comes to rest, he or she normally has to accept the conditions affecting the stroke and not improve them before playing the ball. However, a player may take certain reasonable actions even if they improve these conditions, and there are limited circumstances where conditions may be restored without penalty after they have been improved or worsened. So there's a lot going on there. And what it's kind of looking at there and saying is there's a lot of exceptions, right? So, and that's what makes the rules complicated is there's a lot of things, well, you can do this here, but not here. And this is okay, even if, so there's a lot going on. And it's saying here that here's a bunch of things you can and can't do, but there's also going to be some times where you can do them, and it goes in the opposite way. That's why when we look at the rules here, it's a lot of people say it's like having you're coming in the middle of a conversation. There's a lot going on. So when you read a rule, and this happens all the time when I talk about rules questions, read the whole rule, because sometimes people get to where they think the answer is and they stop, and it's like, well, there's actually 4 exceptions, behind it. Rule 9.4 is a really good example where if you just read the first part of it and you stop, you're going to leave out a lot of information. Those exceptions are just as important. So when we're reading the rule, make sure we want to read the whole thing before we make a ruling, because there's a lot of interconnected things, and not just in the rule itself. Sometimes it'll say, oh, well, refer to Rule 14.5, and it kicks you out that way. So the rules, they're complicated because they're trying to be as fair as possible, and there's just a lot going on. So make sure you read the whole rule too before you're making a ruling or you're deciding something, right? All right, so 8.1. So to support the principle of play the course as you find it, this rule restricts what a player may do to improve any of these protected conditions affecting the stroke anywhere on or off the course for the next stroke the player will make. So real quick here, you look at the first 2 words, improve and conditions affecting the stroke and course, those are all italicized. What that means in the rules is that is a definition. At the back of the rule book, you've got all these definitions to say what the rules of golf mean by that. So the biggest one that we really use here, and not in this specific instance, but is the definition of moved. Moved means, in just general English, a lot of things, but in the rules, it's a very specific thing. So you got to know what the rules say about it, what the definitions say. So whenever you see an italicized word, that's saying there's a definition here. It's in the back of the book. Go look at it. So we're going to cover those here in a minute. But so to support the principle of play the course as you find it, this rule restricts what a player may do to improve. First is the lie of the player's ball at rest. We're going to look at what that means. The area of the player's intended stance. Again, we've got a couple italicized words. Those are definitions we're going to cover in a minute. This restricts what a player may do to improve the area of the player's intended swing. Kind of a definition there. We're going to cover that. The player's line of play. We know what that is, but we're going to look at the definition. And then finally, the relief area, where the player will drop or place a ball. So this area right here, we're going to get into what you can and can't do in Rule 8.1. This is saying, here are the areas that we're talking about. So the rules are talking about the areas first, and then they're going to talk about what you can and can't do in those areas. This is what I like to call, and this is totally a Robert definition, but this is what I call the action area, right? So when we're doing rule seminars, I say this is the action area. It's not an official definition. It's not in the back. This is just something I use as a teaching tool to say this is where your golf is taking place, right? This is everything that's going to affect your golf ball and your swing. Your lie, do you have a good lie or bad lie? Do you have a good stance, bad stance, uneven stance? Where's your body going? Where are you swinging? Do you have things behind you? This is where your golf is taking place. This is what I call the action area. Just again, in our rule seminars, just to say, hey, this is where your golf is going to take place. So again, I mentioned earlier we have the word improve here. That's in italics. What we're going to do is, okay, what does that mean? I think we all kind of have a vague idea of what does improve mean, but the rules are very specific about it. So we're going to look at the definition here of improve. And improve simply states to alter one or more of the conditions affecting the stroke or other physical conditions affecting play so that a player gains a potential advantage for a stroke. So it's saying you cannot improve these areas, and this is what improve means. So again, this is a good example of, you see the italicized word, maybe go to the back and take a look at what exactly it means. Even when I'm still reading the rules, I like to go read this one and read the definitions as I'm reading the rules, because it really helps kind of piece everything together. So, and just real quick, in this rule, we've got to alter one or more of the conditions affecting the stroke. This is essentially a little microcosm of, this is 8.1, and then or other physical conditions, well, that's 8.2. So improve is really big in this rule because it covers 8.1 and 8.2, but this is really where you're going to see this definition applied to. So 8.1 and 8.2, that's where it's really going to come into play, and we're going to cover 8.2 toward the end. So this rule restricts what a player may do to improve the lie of the player's ball at rest. And okay, I think we all know what the lie is, but again, this is the definition. The lie is the spot on which a ball is at rest and any growing or attached natural object, immovable obstruction, integral object, or boundary object touching the ball or right next to it. So this is kind of like the atmosphere around the ball, right? So this is what's going to affect how you play your next stroke. So again, going back to kind of our first picture here, this is what people might say a bad lie, and this is what people might say is a good lie. Well, it might be dependent on what kind of stroke you made. I've hit some good shots out of a divot, and I would call it a bad lie, but a good result. I've hit some really bad shots out of a really good lie, and that's just part of it. So this is your lie here. I think we all know what that is. This is an atmosphere around the ball. So again, going back to the rule, this restricts what a player may do to improve. Number 2 here, the area of the player's intended stance. And we've got kind of an interesting dual definition here. We've got player's intended stance. Well, stance is italicized, so it says the position of the player's feet and body in preparing for making a stroke. And the and body part, that was added in 2019. And it makes sense because, wherever your feet go, also that's where your body's going to go, right? So when you think about stance, a lot of people think about your feet. If you're taking a lesson, say, well, it's going to work on your stance today. But in the context of the rules, the stance include, kind of that silo where your feet and body are going to go. So we're not allowed to improve that. And the second kind of internal definition is when we look at the definition of conditions affecting the stroke, it has an internal definition in there. And it says, and this is just kind of an aside onto this rule. It says, and we're going to look at the next one in a minute, but it says the area of intended stance includes both where the player will place his or her feet and the entire area that might reasonably affect how and where the player's body is positioned in preparing for and making a stroke. So we've got stance and area of intended stance. And that's where do you intend to place your body and your feet in making the stroke. So it covers an area of not necessarily physically where you are, but where do you intend to be. You can't improve that area of intended stance. So it makes it a little more broader in the area of protected, I think. It makes it a little more broader of what's covered under this rule. And as we know, again, wherever your feet go, that's where your body's going to go. So this is a good picture of, okay, well, his area of intended stance includes obviously the area on the ground, but it also includes, for this guy, where is his body going to go? That area is protected. You can't improve that, meaning he can't say, oh, I'm going to break these branches off and bend these branches around one another to get a better, angle at the ball and get a better stance for myself. So that's a protected area. So it restricts what a player may do to improve the area of intended swing. Again, going back to that definition of conditions affecting the stroke, we have kind of an internal definition of the definition again, saying the area of intended swing includes the entire area that might reasonably affect any part of the backswing, the downswing, or the completion of the swing for the intended stroke. So again, where do you intend to swing the club, right? Where's that area where on the backswing, follow through, anything that's going to affect where your club is going to go through. So this is the area of intended swing. Where do you intend to swing? So again, here's a good area right here. So guys playing the ball out to the right, he hit it there. Those are natural and growing attached objects. We're gonna get to that in the next section, but those were there first. He hit his ball there, and now he's improving his area of intended swing to say, if I knock these down, I'm gonna have a better time getting my club at the ball through my backswing. So right here, he's improving a condition affecting the stroke, and that is his area of intended swing. Can't do this. That's part of the game here. You're playing on a golf course. There's going to be living, breathing things on the golf course here, so you can't bend or break those, and we're going to cover that more here in a little bit. Similarly here, right? Can't do this. So playing toward the flag in the background. Well, this tall grass is in my way. I'm going to step on it to improve my area of intended swing, my backswing, and my downswing probably. She's bending and breaking something natural here. Can't do that. That is a protected area right there. So finally, it says, it says the restricts what a player may do to improve the player's line of play. Again, we've got a definition here. What is the line of play? It says, well, the line of play is where the player intends his or her ball to go after a stroke, including the area on that line that is a reasonable distance up above the ground and on either side of that line. So here it's kind of interesting because it's a reasonable distance. They don't give a concrete distance, right? That's on your line of play. There is some verbiage when you look at a temporary movable obstruction, when you look at like what a corridor is, where you've got a club length on either side of the edge of the TIO, and they establish a club length. That's more for a relief procedure. But here it's a little bit more gray, where it says it's a reasonable distance up above the ground on either side. So it's not set in stone, but when applying the rules, you'd say, well, did you improve an area that's within a reasonable distance on your line of play? And it says the line of play is not necessarily in a straight line between 2 points. For example, it may be on a curved line based on where the player intends the ball to go. Well, as we know that, sometimes the line of play, I intend for the ball to go one way, but it goes the other way. So it doesn't always work out. However, it's where do you intend the ball to go? When you watch on tour golf, they have the shot tracker. You see a lot of how much the players bend and move the ball. Not every shot, and rarely a lot of shots are actually straight. There's always some movement on it. I think we see that more when we watch tour coverage because we're getting those tracers. And so that's a good example of what is a line of play. It's not necessarily a straight line. So this is an example of that, right? So to clarify here, she's not on the putting green. The putting green's over here. Where she's patting down is an area of raised turf that's in her line of play on her way to the putting green. So you can't improve that because she's playing a low running shot. She's repairing an area that's in the general area. Again, what area of the course is that in? And she's not allowed to do that. We'll get to this later, but if this was on the putting green, she's repairing a pitch mark on the putting green, that's always fine. We're going to be fine with that, and that's where an exception comes in. But here, playing through the general area, she's not gonna be able to do that. So lastly, restricts what a player may do to improve the relief area. And the relief area is simply the area where a player must drop a ball when taking relief under a rule. Each relief rule requires the player to use a specific relief area whose size and location are based on these 3 factors. We're not going to get into that at the moment. That'll be covered in Rule 14 more so. But this is the relief area, right? You got a ball and a sprinkler head. We're taking relief. That's your reference point in your relief area. You can't improve something in your relief area to say, oh, I'm going to I'm going to tap down this divot and replace these areas of cut turf because I'm going to drop my ball here. I want it to be proper and have a good lie when I do that. That's a protected area. And then it finishes with saying this rule applies to actions taken both during a round and while play is stopped under Rule 5.7a. So essentially saying once your round is started to when it finishes, you don't get a pass because there's a lightning delay and you can go do these things. It's from your first stroke to when you hold out on the fathom hole. This applies. So this rule also applies to the actions taken both during or when play is stopped under 5.7a. It does not apply to the removal of loose impediments or movable obstructions, which is allowed to the extent provided in Rule 15, or an action taken while a player's ball is in motion, which is covered by Rule 11. So that second area there, it says if something happens when your ball's in motion, this is going to be covered by Rule 11.3. So it's saying don't look here, go there. And the rules do that sometimes. They'll say, while this rule could be applicable in 8.1, Rule 11.3 is going to be the one that covers it. And then it also mentions, it doesn't apply to the removal of loose impediments or movable obstructions. A good example of that is the last thing we looked at is your relief area. If you've got a loose impediment in your relief area, you're going to drop a ball and there's some leaves there, you can always move those leaves. That is not part of a protected conditions affecting the stroke. We get into loose impediments and movable obstructions more in Rule 15, but at the moment we're just looking at that relief area. They're not part of the protected area there necessarily. All right. So looking at 8.1a, this is the big part of the rule here. This is really the kind of the cornerstone of this rule here. It says actions that are not allowed. So right here we're looking at what is not allowed. What are you not allowed to do in those areas? So except in the limited ways allowed in 8.1b, c, and d, a player must not take any of these actions if they improve the conditions affecting the stroke. Again, we're already set up nicely here because we looked at what does improve mean and then the conditions affecting the stroke. So armed with that, we're able to kind of look into the rule and understand it a little better. So it says you are not allowed, first part says, to move, bend, or break any growing or attached natural object, an immovable obstruction, integral object, or boundary object. Those are fixed, can't move those, or tee marker for the teeing area when playing a ball from that teeing area. So if you think the tee markers are crooked, you're not allowed to move those. Those are protected under 8.1a1 here. Can't move those, can't improve those, right? So 2 is move a loose impediment, an action not allowed. Move a loose impediment or movable obstruction into position, such as building a stance, or to improve the line of play. An example here would be this guy right here, right? His ball's in a tree, 8 feet up in the air. Well, I'm going to move this bench over here so that I can get up and play this ball better, I guess. And he's building a stance, very literally building a stance. Similarly, if you moved a movable obstruction or loose impediment to help your line of play, that would also be a breach. Again, this rule is playing the course as you find it. So conversely, if he hit his ball here and the bench was already there, he's not building a stance, right? He's just playing the course as he found it. So in that case, it's okay. What he can't do, and what the rules are saying here, he can't move this bench over here to build a stance, right? It doesn't happen that much, but just an important little area there that the rules are covering. So we're not allowed to alter the surface of the ground, including by replacing divots in a divot hole, removing or pressing down divots that have already been replaced, or other cut turf that is already in place, or creating or eliminating holes, indentations, or uneven surfaces. So this whole part right here is surface of the ground. And when you think about it, this is truly where golf is played, right? Your ball is always being played off of the ground, except in that last picture, right? Your ball is always being played off the ground. It comes to rest on the ground. You're putting it along the ground. Maybe you're chipping it along the ground, play a low running shot, and eventually the ball ends by being in the hole inside the ground. So this is a big one because it's saying you can't alter those areas. And we're going to see some exceptions on that, but you can't alter those areas to improve your maybe line of play or your stance or your live ball. So you're not allowed to remove or press down sand or loose soil. In a very large way, that's what the golf course is made out of. So you can imagine if you were allowed to move sand and loose soil, we've seen it on tour a few times, or people maybe do that. You could really build yourself a lie. So that's what the golf course is made out of. I mean, at some point, all the dirt's going to be sand or loose soil, so you can't move that. We're going to see some exceptions when it comes to the putting green. And again, that's a very specific area of the course And that's why it's important to know these exceptions and these other rules we're going to cover. So you're not allowed to remove dew, frost, or water. So again, that's part of the grounds, part of the golf course. We're going to look at some areas where you can do that, but in the rules here, 8.1A5, we're going to say you can't remove those dew, frost, or water in your condition affecting the stroke to improve your line of play or anything else. And this is kind of an example of that. You're creating a runway to the hole. This is removing dew, frost, or water on the putting green. Can't do that. And then at the end, it says, for breach of this rule, you're going to get the general penalty. Well, this is the first time we've really seen this newer concept for the rules in 2019 is what is the general penalty? And there's a definition for that, obviously. It says general penalty is a loss of hole in match play or 2 penalty strokes in stroke play. So it does depend on what form of play you're doing here. So if it's match play, you're simply going to lose the hole. In stroke play, it's a 2-stroke penalty. So this is where knowing what format you're in. So if someone says, well, what's the penalty? Or if you're taking a rules test or quiz, say, well, what's the penalty? What form of play is it? That's going to really help determine what the penalty is. So this is our first look at general penalty here. So now in 8.1b, we're going to look at the actions that are allowed. So in 8.1a, we looked at, well, here's what you can't do. In 8.1b, well, here's what you can do. And even if, and we're going to see, even if they improve the conditions affecting the stroke. And the rule says, in preparing for or making a stroke, a player may take any of these actions, and there's no penalty, even if doing so improves the conditions affecting the stroke, right? So you're allowed to do this, within a very few circumstances, no matter what. It's going to allow you to do this, and there's no penalty, even if you improve the conditions affecting the stroke. So it's like what I was saying earlier, it's very important to read the entirety of the rule, because if you just stop, you're going to miss, there's about 11 things here that says you can do it. So there's a lot going on here. So we're going to get into this. So the first one says that you are allowed to fairly search for his or her ball by taking reasonable actions to find and identify it. We don't cover this, but Rule 6.3 covers what happens if you play a wrong ball. The rules are very penal about that. You're going to get either A, the general penalty, or B, in stroke play, if you don't correct it by teeing off the next hole, you're going to be disqualified. That's the most serious penalty you can apply. So the rules are going to say you better identify your golf ball, and we're going to allow you to do that. And even if you improve the condition affecting the stroke, that's still okay, because it's very important. If you don't identify your golf ball, that's on you. We have that happen a lot in tournaments where, like, well, I didn't know it wasn't my ball. They're playing a wrong ball. And the rule says, well, if you're ever unsure, you can always mark it, pick it up. Yes, that's my ball. Put it right back. So it's very important that you do that. And it starts off with saying, when doing that, if you improve the conditions affecting the stroke, you're not going to be penalized. So here we have this picture. As I think that's my ball. He's reaching in there. Maybe he breaks, a growing or attached natural object. That's no penalty, because if it's reasonable when trying to identify his ball, the rules are going to mandate the player do that. And if they don't, then they're going to be penalized pretty heavily. You don't have to identify your golf ball. Recommended that you do. Most people have identifying marks. They don't really need to get an up close look. But in this case, he's got to make sure he's playing the right ball here. So you are allowed to take reasonable actions to remove loose impediments and movable obstructions, which is covered by Rule 15.1 and 15.2. We'll get into that here in a few weeks. So you are allowed to do that if you improve the conditions affecting the stroke. That's okay. Take reasonable actions to mark the spot of the ball and lift and replace the ball under Rule 14.1 or 14.2. We'll get more into Rule 14 here in a few weeks. And notice the last few, it says take reasonable actions. It's also inferring if you take unreasonable actions, that would be a breach of this rule. So when you take reasonable actions and you maybe improve the conditions affecting the stroke, under these instances, that's going to be fine. But you're going to see the word reasonable a lot in these new rules. That's one thing we get from our rule seminars afterwards. People say, wow, reasonable and purposeful, that's or deliberately. That's a big word in the rules now. So actions that are allowed, we have ground the club lightly right in front of or right behind the ball. But this does not allow pressing the club on the ground, or when a ball is in a bunker, touching the sand right in front of or right behind the ball. So here it says, like I said earlier, if a player said, well, can I ground my club? I'd say, well, what area of the course is your ball in? If a player said, well, can I ground my club? And I said, yeah, go for it. Oh, I didn't know they were in a bunker. Well, I've just given wrong information. So it's very important to know what area of the course the ball's in, because here it says very specifically, and this is covered more in Rule 12, which that's a big rule. We'll get into that here in a few weeks as well. In your bunker, you can't do that. So when we look at this, it says ground the club lightly. Well, what does that mean? And this is where the interpretations come in. So if you have a official guide to the rules of golf, we would look in rule 8.1b. Real quick, we'll look at, well, what does ground the club lightly mean? Well, ground the club lightly, and this is an internal definition. You're not going to find ground the club lightly in the definitions. It's going to be more in 8 in the interpretations of 8.1b. Because ground the club lightly means allowing the weight of the club to be supported by the grass, soil, sand, or other materials on or above the ground surface. So, it means letting the weight of the club being supported by the earth. And that, we all know what that means, right? It's when the club's on the ground, you've kind of got maybe the grip in your hands lightly. Now that's grounding the club lightly. You're allowed to do that. And here you see it mentions grass, soil, or sand or other materials. Well, we just heard about, well, in a bunker, you can't do that. Again, very important to know what area of the course you're in. We know in the picture on the left, that's fine. On the picture on the right, they're in the general area. They're very clearly not in a bunker. See a lot of courses, maybe if you're on one of the coasts, North Carolina or Northern California, let's say, there's a lot more sand out there. You can ground your club lightly right here, right? So the person on the right, as long as they're not really, pushing down and creating, a good lie for themselves, the rules are saying this is fine. Ground your club lightly behind the ball, even if it does knock some sand down and improve your condition affecting the stroke, which is your lie, you're going to be okay with that. So again, very important here. They're still grounding it in the sand, but it's not in the bunker. That's where reading the rules critically does come into play. Because if you just read sand, you'd say, oh, this isn't allowed. This is sand except in a bunker. So again, we know we can't do this, right? Anytime we're playing, and you see someone ground the club in the bunker, it's like, you can't do that. It still kind of looks weird whenever I see people do that. It's just so foreign to the rules here. So we can't do that. So you are allowed to firmly place the feet in taking a stance, including a reasonable amount of digging with the feet in the sand or loose soil. And that's a good addition. Again, we see the word reasonable. The first thing you do when you get to your golf ball in a bunker or a natural sandy area is you kind of establish your base there, right? You take your stance, you ground your feet, because when you swing, you want to make sure you don't fall over, right? So this is what we're meaning right here, right? You can establish a good stance. Doesn't mean build a stance. That's a whole separate thing, but to firmly ground your feet here, make sure you don't fall. And that this isn't a natural sandy area. This is Bill Haas. This isn't a natural sandy area. Obviously, in a bunker, we know we can do that as well. So actions that are allowed, you are allowed to fairly take your stance by taking reasonable actions to get to the ball and take a stance. Again, seeing the word reasonable here. That's what we're gonna see in a lot of these rules. But when in doing so, the player is not entitled to a normal stance or swing and must use the least intrusive course of action to deal with the particular situation. So this does not mean you can, kind of like the picture we saw here and we saw earlier, carte blanche, go in there and just knock everything down. You've got to take a reasonable action. The rules are going to still allow you to play your game, right? This is a right-handed player. His ball's up against the tree. He's going to back in the least intrusive manner and be able to make his swing. This doesn't mean he has to play left-handed because the ball's in that situation. He's just got to be very careful when taking his stance, which again is feet and body, that he's taking the least intrusive action. So even when doing this, if he's backing into this tree in a reasonable way, in the least intrusive manner, and he breaks a branch, typically that's a condition affecting the stroke that's protected, right, by your stance, where your body goes. Here, in taking reasonable actions to do that, he's not going to be penalized. Conversely, if he goes in and just snaps all these branches off to clear out, that's very obviously not reasonable and not at all least intrusive. So very important to know that one. So you are allowed to make a stroke or the backswing for a stroke, which is then made. But when the ball is in a bunker, touching sand in the bunker and taking the backswing is not allowed under Rule 12.2b1. So again, very specific here to say, okay, in the bunker, can't do that, right? You can't take your backswing and touch sand. We know if you're in a bunker and on the way back you clip sand, you're going to get penalized the general penalty. However, what it's saying is more along the lines of this picture right here. Here's the ball, the club on the way back. It's gonna blow up this little tree here, which normally is a condition affecting the stroke. Well, when you're making your stroke to play the ball, if you break that, that's not going to be a penalty because you're playing your game right now, right? That's in your action area. It's in the way. If you do it, and we see it a lot on tour, right? Your players' balls under a tree. They're very careful about where their club can go and not breaking those branches. When they actually pull the trigger, if you're back there and you hear a branch break, you better keep going, because if you stop, you essentially just improve the condition affecting the stroke in a practice swing. So you better keep playing. You better keep going. You're allowed to do that. Again, but it also says in a bunker that that's not the case. You can't slide all the sand out in a bunker on the way back and clear it out or your way through. That's always going to be prohibited. So you are allowed in the teeing area to place a tee in the ground. This is pretty obvious stuff here. Move, bend, or break any growing or attached natural object, and alter the surface of the ground, remove or press down sand or loose soil, or remove dew, frost, or water. So when we looked at the first part of this rule, it says you can't improve a condition affecting the stroke by removing sand and soil, dew, frost, and water. Well, it says, again, reading into the rule, except in the teeing area. Now, as we know, the rules are going to give you a perfect lie in the teeing area. You can tee the ball up to 4 inches off the ground and play it. So if they're going to let you do that, they're also going to let you do these things, right? So, we see Laura Davies does it where she, in maybe on a par 3, you kind of tap the ground up and get a tuft of grass up to put your ball on. That's totally fine. Peeling back a second, it says rule 6.2b3. Want to be specific here. Let's look at that rule right quick. And it says there's only certain conditions in the teeing area that may be improved. So this is a good example of how the rules are very intertwined. And it says before making a stroke, the player may take these actions in the teeing area to improve the conditions affecting the stroke. And specifically alter, and this is the surface of the ground. So this doesn't mean, oh, there's a tree in the teeing area, I can break that because it's in the teeing area. That's not a common situation. Most time teeing area, the airspace is unaffected, but it's saying the surface of the ground. So while earlier we saw on the putting green, this was not something you could do. On the teeing area, they're giving you, do whatever you want to do. In this case, you can mop up the ground there. I've never seen anybody do this. Not that you can't, but it's just not very common. But since you can tee it up, the rules are going to give you a lot of leeway and freedom in the teeing area here when starting the hole there. So in the teeing area there. So you are allowed here, right? So in a bunker, smooth sand to care for the course after a ball is played from the bunker is outside the bunker. So once you've played out of a bunker, we certainly hope you're caring for the course. Obviously, with COVID, there was a little less of that going on because there weren't rakes out as touch points, which is fine. But once we're back to normal, once your ball's out, the rules are saying it is okay to smooth the bunker, and it's very obviously encouraged. Please do smooth the bunker once you're out. This would even be the case if, let's say, you hit the ball from the bunker and it goes out of bounds and you're required to play under stroke and distance in the bunker. And this is rule 12, but we're going to look at that later. The rules would say that's still okay to do. You're still allowed to rake the bunker before you drop it because ball's outside the bunker. You have freedom to rake. That's totally fine. So you are allowed on the putting green to remove sand and loose soil and repair damage, which again, we certainly hope that you're doing. When you make a pitch mark on the putting green, please fix that. And it's going to say you can remove sand and loose soil. So here we've got sand. And again, earlier we looked at, okay, well, sand is not something you can improve. Reading into this rule, except on the putting green, you can move sand. So in this case, let's say your ball's, near a bunker and there's a lot of splashing out and you're on the putting green, you can remove the sand or loose soil on the putting green. This does not mean that sand or loose soil is a loose impediment. It just means that it can be removed on the putting green. It also means that it doesn't matter if your ball is on or off the putting green. If you're chipping and there's some sand in your line of play on the putting green, you can remove the sand like he's doing here on the putting green. Anywhere on the course, you're not able to remove sand to improve your conditions affecting the stroke. So if part of the sand is in the fringe and you're putting through it, you can move the sand on the putting green, but not the fringe. Obviously, we just talked about the teeing area. It said you could do that. That's rarely the case, but here again, when you're near the putting green, don't touch the sand unless it's physically on the putting green. It's a good rule of thumb. So finally, you are allowed to move a natural object to see if it is loose, but if the object is found to be growing or attached, it must stay attached and be returned as nearly as possible to its original position. Doesn't happen that much, but if you're saying, well, is this divot in the ground? Yeah, it is. Okay, you need to leave it be. You're allowed to move to see if it's loose, and then if it is loose, you obviously have to let it be. Or if it's not loose, you have to let it be in the ground there. So getting into 8.1c, again, like I said, most of our time here, is going to be in rule 8.1. This one's going to be, a little more complicated here. It says, and this is a new change. This is a really good change, and this is a new one. But it's avoiding penalty by restoring conditions improved in breach of rule 8.1a or 8.1a2. So if the player has improved a condition affecting the stroke by moving, bending, or breaking an object in breach of rule 8.1a, or moving an object into breach of rule 8.1a2, and we're going to pause here and just rewind for a second. Well, what is rule 8.1a? Let's review that. It says actions that are not allowed, 8.1a1. You cannot move, bend, or break any growing or attached natural object, immovable obstruction, integral object, boundary object, tee marker for the teeing area when playing a ball from that teeing area. And then similarly going back, 8.1a2. Well, 8.1a2 is what we saw about moving a loose impediment or movable obstruction in a position to build a stance or improve the line of play. So what this rule is saying here is you can't do those things. But if you do that before making the stroke, you're allowed to restore those conditions to avoid penalty. We'll get into some of the ways it used to be, but this is a new change and a good change. It goes on to say, kind of what I just said, there is no penalty if, before making the next stroke, the player eliminates that improvement by restoring the original conditions in the ways allowed in 1 and 2 below. So if you do breach any one of those things in 8.1a1 or 8.1a2, if before you play the stroke, you eliminate it, you're not going to be penalized, right? So in the ways 1 and 2 below, what does that say? Dropping down a little bit, says before making the stroke, the player may avoid penalty for breach of 8.1a by restoring the original object as nearly as possible to its original position so that the improvement created by the breach is eliminated, such as replacing a boundary object, such as a boundary stake, that has been removed, or moving the boundary object back into its original position after it had been pushed to a different angle, or returning a tree branch or grass or a movable obstruction to its original position after it had been moved. So used to be, if someone moved an out of bounds stake right away, they were penalized. Even if you put it back, if you moved it to improve your condition affecting the stroke, in this case, the player here is removing it to improve their stance or area of intended swing. If before that player plays the ball, someone said, you can't do that, thank you, my bad, put it back, there's no penalty, and now you have to navigate around that stake there. So this is a good change. You're allowed to recreate or eliminate the improvement rather. Same thing here. This player is coming into the branch and moving it out of their way. We've talked about this is not the least intrusive action. So before she plays the ball, she can come back, take her hand off the tree, get it back to its original position. Trees have a certain element of elasticity usually, so it'll bounce back to where it really was. If she were to break this branch, we're going to find out you can improve that, and you kind of spilt the milk there, and it's genie's out of the bottle. You're going to get penalized. But in this case, if before she plays it, someone says, "Oh, can't do that. Thank you. Move it. Get out of the way." Retake her stance with the least intrusive action. Again, what the rules say, or I'm just saying. It says, but the player cannot avoid penalty if the improvement is not eliminated, such as when a boundary object or branch has been bent or broken in a significant way so that it cannot be returned to the original position. Like I just said, if you snap that branch, that's that. By using anything other than the original object itself in trying to restore conditions such as, this doesn't happen very much, so it's interesting that it's in here like this, but using a different or additional object, for example, placing a different stake in a hole from which a boundary stake had been removed. I don't know how people have extra boundary stakes when they play, or by using other materials to repair the object. For example, using tape to repair a broken boundary object. Again, I'm not sure how many people play with a roll of tape or would think to retape a boundary object or a branch if they were to break it. So rules are saying you can't use those additional items to restore. You have to use the original stake or branch in its full capacity to restore those conditions. And there is a very specific interpretation about that, and I'm not going to get into that right now, but where there's a little bit of leeway there. So next, how to restore conditions improved by moving an object into position. Before making the stroke, the player may avoid penalty for breach of rule 8.1a2 by removing the object that was moved into position. Very simply, if this player had moved the bench to build a stance and someone said, hey, you can't do that, very simply, just remove the bench and you would avoid penalty before playing the ball. It says, but if the player improves the condition affecting the stroke by taking any of the other actions covered by rules 8.1a3 through 5, he or she cannot avoid penalty by restoring those original conditions. And again, kind of peeling back here, 8.1a3 through 5 You cannot avoid those. And those are altering the surface of the ground. So if you've done this, once you've, replaced a divot back in the divot hole, you've put earth back into earth. You can't unimprove that. That's just the way it is. Obviously pressing down divots or replacing other cut turf, you can't recut the turf and recreate that truly. Similarly, remove or press down sand or loose soil. So if you've removed sand and someone says, oh, you can't do that, that's not something you can really recreate. You can't go grab more sand and sprinkle it back to where it was to recreate it. You've moved that sand and truly you really can't fix that. You can't get it back. You cannot get it back to original. And then lastly, removing dew, frost, or water, right? If you mop up that water, how are you going to recreate that? You can't. So the rules are saying once you've breached 3, 4, or 5 here, you're going to get stuck with the general penalty. You cannot improve those or recreate those rather. In 1 and 2, there is an area where, okay, well, put the stake back. We're good. So 1 and 2, you can fix. 3, 4, and 5, you can't fix those. Once you've done it, you've done it. So last thing at 8.1D and 8.1 rather is D here, restoring conditions worsened after ball came to rest. This is our last big section. We're going to be done here shortly. Once we get past 8.1, 8.2, and 8.3, we'll be close to done here. So if the conditions affecting the stroke are worsened after a player's ball came to rest, says if the conditions affecting the stroke are worsened by any person other than the player or by an animal or artificial object without penalty, player may. And before we get there, this is talking about worsening. This is not talking about improving. If someone else, if another person or an animal improved it, we're not talking about that. We're talking about worsening conditions, right? And we'll go over a few examples here. And specifically, any person other than the player or by an animal or an artificial object. So essentially, it's any person other than the player. And at the bottom of this rule in the blue text, it would say a partner is also responsible. And then an interpretation in 8.1D2/2, it says our caddy as well. So if the player, caddy, partner, their caddy worsens a condition affecting the stroke, that's not allowed to be improved. But any other person, such as referee, or a spectator or whatever, worsens a condition, we're going to look at how you can restore that. Says you can, first of all, restore the original conditions as nearly as possible. There's a lot of situations, I won't be terribly specific on that, where you can restore it. You can mark the spot of the ball and lift, clean, and replace the ball in its original spot if it is reasonable to do so, to restore the original conditions, or if material ended up on the ball when the conditions were worsened. A good example is your ball is in the fringe and there's a bunker behind you, and someone else in your group, splashes sand onto your ball. Again, you were entitled to play the course as you found it. So when they put sand on your ball, they've worsened your condition, call it the lie, and you're allowed to restore that under the second bullet point here. And then lastly is if the worsened condition cannot be easily restored, lift and replace the ball. And specifically the ball, we're still using the same ball here, by placing it on the nearest spot, not near the hole. That 1 has the most similar conditions affecting the stroke. 2 is within 1 club length of its original spot. And 3 is in the same area of the course as that spot. So a good example here is your golf ball in the rough, it's run over by a golf cart and it pushes the ball on the ground. You're allowed, and let's say it was somebody else's golf cart. It was someone in another group. It wasn't you, and that's different, or you're not searching for it. Someone else runs over it, another group. You're allowed on this third bullet point to say, well, very obviously it's in the ground now. So you're going to, 1 has the most similar condition affecting the stroke. So probably guesstimating what kind of lie it was in and placing that ball, within a club length of that and in the same area of the course. So if your ball's in the rough and it gets run over by someone else, you could pick it up, clean it, place it in the nearest spot that was most similar to what your original lie was. And if you don't know your original lie, which you might not, you're going to estimate it. That's covered in Rule 14, which we'll get to in a few weeks. All right. And this is, again, just another interpretation that says, here's some examples very specifically. And I actually kind of already covered that in the second and third bullet point. So we're going to kind of go through that one. So in the exception here is, again, a lot of it, this is our first exception we've kind of seen. Lie of the ball worsened when or after a ball is lifted or moved and before it was replaced. This is covered by Rule 14.2D, unless the lie was worsened when play was stopped and the ball was lifted, in which case this rule applies. This is if play was stopped in Rule 5.7 and your conditions were altered or worsened during that time, it kicks you to here and says 8.1d is applicable. We're not going to get into that at all. So this is just an exception that kind of refers to something else calling back in here. So the second part here, when restoration of worsened conditions is not allowed, if the conditions affecting the stroke are worsened by the player, by a natural object, or by natural forces such as wind or water, theoretically gravity is a natural force that doesn't really apply here so much. But the player must not improve those worsened conditions in breach of Rule 8.1a, except as allowed in 8.1c1, 8.1c2, or 13.1c. So if, one of these things worsens it, that's part of the golf course, right? Natural objects, natural forces. If, the wind makes your conditions affecting the stroke worse, that's part of playing the game. You're going to have wind, you're going to have water. So that's 8.1. So we finished that one. That's the big one. 8.2 and 3 are very short, and they really hinge off of 8.1. So by knowing 8.1, we kind of can go into 8.2 here. So 8.2 is players' deliberate actions to alter other physical conditions to affect the player's own ball at rest or stroke to be made. So this is the other physical conditions, right? And it says when this applies, this rule only covers the player's deliberate actions to alter other physical conditions to affect his or her ball at rest or stroke to be made. So when we see the word other there highlighted, we know that the original ones, that was that action area, right? The lie, the stance, swing, line of play, relief area, that's where your golf is being played. That's a very specific area, right? That's your action area. 8.2 covers all those other things that are not in your action area. So just because you don't do something in breach of 8.1 and say, oh, well, it's not covered by 8.1, 8.2 still is going to cover that, right? So that's the other conditions affecting the stroke. That's anything outside the action area here, as I call it. So this does not apply to a player's actions to deliberately deflect or stop his or her own ball, or to deliberately alter any physical conditions to affect where a ball might come to rest, which again is covered by 11.2 or 11.3. So this is saying if we're talking about a ball in motion here, we're going to go to 11.2 or 11.3, or it might come to rest rather, not necessarily ball in motion. But it's kicking you out and saying you might get to here, but this 11.2 or 3 is what's really going to cover it. And then it says alter the player's conditions affecting the stroke, which is covered by 8.1. So it's kicking you back and saying, okay, if it's one of the conditions affecting the stroke of the action area, 8.1, all this other stuff, that's 8.2. 8.2b says a player must not deliberately take any of the actions listed in 8.1, which we've covered, except as allowed in 8.1b, c, or d, which are all those, you can improve the lie in the teeing area, right? To alter any such other physical conditions to affect where the player's ball might go or come to rest after his or her next stroke or a later stroke, or where the player's ball at rest might go or come to rest if it moves before the stroke is made. For example, when the ball is on a steep slope and the player is concerned that it might roll into a bush. So in that regard, in that situation, your ball's in a steep slope. You say, well, the bush is not in my action area. I can go improve it. No, because that's prohibited by 8.2. That's an other physical condition affecting the stroke. So you would be breaking a branch or moving a bush or something to affect an upcoming condition affecting the stroke. That's not okay. The rules are going to say that's protected as well. And the exception is, and this is an important one, this is an interesting one too, this is actions to care for the course. And it says there's no penalty under this rule if the player alters any such other physical condition to care for the course, such as smoothing footprints in a bunker or replacing a divot in a divot hole. The important thing about this is not listed in 8.1. This exception is only in 8.2 and 8.3. So you're not going to be able to care for the course, and rake around your ball because, oh, I'm caring for the course. That's a protected condition affecting the stroke. You can't improve your lie there. But it's saying if there's other physical conditions affecting the stroke. So if you're waiting to play and there's a bunker over there and it's in disarray, you're allowed to go rake it, even though it may be protected by 8.2, because it could be another condition affecting the stroke. You're caring for the course. So if you say, I'm going to go care for the course over there, you rake the bunker, fine. You hit it, your ball ends up back in that raked area, you're going to be fine because of this exception right here. You were caring for the course, that's okay. 8.3, this is our last one, and this is players' deliberate actions to alter physical conditions to affect another player's ball at rest or stroke to be made. So in 8.1a, in 8.1 and 8.2, that's your condition affecting the stroke. And then 8.2 is your other, and they're not conditions affecting the stroke, right? Those areas not in the action area, everything else. 8.3 is taking both of those concepts, the conditions affecting the stroke and other conditions affecting the stroke, for another player. So while 8.1 and 8.2 cover the player's conditions affecting the stroke, 8.3 says this is for other players, right? So I'm sorry, 8.1 and 8.2, it's conditions affecting the stroke, and then not the conditions affecting the stroke. 8.3 is using other players. This is where someone else is. So meaning you can't go alter physical conditions for another player as a loophole to say, oh, well, they're not doing it, I'm doing it. 8.3 is going to kick in, and this is where you can't do that. So you're not allowed to alter someone else's conditions affecting the stroke. Says this rule only covers a player's deliberate actions to alter physical conditions to affect another player's ball at rest or stroke to be made by that other player. It does not apply to a player's actions to deliberately deflect or stop another player's ball in motion, or to deliberately alter any physical conditions to affect where the ball might come to rest, which is covered by 8.1, 11.2, and 11.3. That's going to kick you out to that rule. And it doesn't really say necessarily if it's stroke play or match play. It just says another player. So it could be your opponent in match play. It says a player must not deliberately take any of the actions listed in 8.1a, all those things we covered, except 1b, c, or d, to improve or worsen conditions affecting the stroke of another player. So this is really just taking 8.1 and 8.2 for the player and condensing them right into 8.3 for another player. Improve or worsening conditions affecting the stroke. This is where this is kind of stored at. It says then alter any other physical conditions, again, not the action area, to affect where the player's ball might go or come to rest after the player's next stroke or later stroke, or where another player's ball at rest might go or come to rest if it moves before the stroke's made. So again, we're seeing a lot of the same things really condensed in 8.1 and 2 in here for the other player. So again, 8.2 and 3 really do hinge on knowing 8.1 because there's so many references it's saying the things in 8.1 you can't do for yourself, you also cannot do for another player. This is where it spreads out for that. And then finally, with the same exception we saw, actions to care for the course. There's no penalty under this rule if the player alters any such other physical conditions to care for the course, such as smoothing footprints in a bunker or placing a divot in a divot hole. So again, only in 8.2 and 8.3 do you see this exception to care for the course. So that's kind of it for 8.3. That's the last part of it, and that's the end of the rule here, right? So we covered a lot today and a little over time, I know, but definitely I think got a lot out of it. So that's kind of where we've ended at, and this is the end of that presentation. So at this point, if we've got any questions or any comments about what we just covered or any questions in there, I didn't really stop in the middle of it because obviously we were kind of a little pushed for time, so I wanted to kind of get through that. But I'm here to hang out as long as you want to hang out if anybody has any questions, whether it's about anything we covered here, something that kind of popped up as we were talking about it, or anything else, just something random that you might have thought of that doesn't have anything to do with Rule 8. So Ashley, I don't know if we've got any questions in the question bar to go over, or if we just want to open it up and have the microphones on. But do we have any questions first in the comment boxes that I can kind of help cover?
No questions came in through the chat, Robert, but if you have them, send them in, or feel free to unmute your microphone and explain yourself that way too.
Yeah, so yeah, and if you want to unmute your microphone, I mean, sometimes rules questions are very hard to type. I understand that. I do a lot myself. So if it's something you want to just talk about, let's just do that. So.
Yeah, Robert, it's Peter.
Hello, Peter and Susan. How are you?
Yeah, pretty good. I'm never sure how far a player can push back a bush, which will, if he moves out of the way, it will be restored to its original position. But how far can that player push into those branches to be able to play his stroke?
Well, that's a good question, and it's a good officiating question, which I would expect from Peter and Susan. They are our volunteers of the year this year, so thank you all for your hard work. So that makes perfect sense coming from you. So thank you.
Thank you.
But the rules don't give a how far exactly, right? It's a lot of times we saw the word reasonable. So it's not like, oh, well, at 3 inches, that's too far. Now you're gonna have a penalty. it's reasonable, and that might be, based on any given situation, right? So what's reasonable for one person might not be reasonable for another based on the situation where the bush is or how big that person is. The way to correctly kind of approach that I think with thought is when a player's got a bush or out of bounds, like they're allowed to, take their least intrusive stroke. So if I'm backing into a bush to play my normal stroke there or least intrusive stroke, that's fine if it breaks. I guess if you're asking about like pushing it, like in the picture with the girl kind of moving the branch down, if she's corrected it before she's made the stroke, that's fine. So there's really not a distance. It's, if you can correct it, you will, hopefully. And if you can't, you've already broken it. I guess, again, kind of peeling back to that first part of the question was when you're backing into a bush, there's not a distance. You take your stance, and if someone's unreasonable, like they're sticking their leg out, what would be unreasonable for a stroke, then that's going to be different. That's going to be where they're over the line. So there's not a concrete distance there. It's just did what they do is reasonable? Was it unreasonable? That's going to help you determine how to apply the rules there. So does that help? Does that help, or did I miss it?
No, that's okay. Yeah, I mean, obviously you can be a little bit flexible, but you can't just let people go crashing into things.
Exactly, and that's why they have the word reasonable there, which is a really good word for it. Is, again, if the bush is way over here and I really step out of the way to, well, that's not reasonable. That's not how I play my game. That's not how I take my stance. But if I'm taking my stance and I'm backing into a bush just to play my ball, you'd say, well, was that reasonable? And that's up to the player and the official in the given situation. But I think once it crosses the line of unreasonable, that's up to, the official or whoever's applying the rules to decide what's reasonable and unreasonable. But I think unreasonable is one of the things when you see it. You know what I mean? It's usually pretty obvious, I think.
Yeah,
Okay,
Robert, we had
thank
one
you.
follow-up question come in the chat there from Joe. Is it reasonable equals Tigers moving of the boulder at the Phoenix Open, or is that unreasonable?
That was a long time ago. And actually the rules, there's an interpretation that specifically says that if the loose impediment, that boulder can be moved by a gallery or your friends, and it's a loose impediment, that's okay to do. And that's a good point because, this rule, it specifically states in the very beginning, it does not apply to loose impediments or movable obstructions. So that would kick you out to Rule 15. This rule is talking about one of those, a fixed, attached, growing, or natural object. A stone like that, like what Tiger did, is not a something that's going to categorize under 8.1. And again, there's and I think in my rule book I have the note says Tiger, Tiger rule, where that's okay now, and it was then, but usually we don't have a gallery watching us, so they usually don't even have that access. So that's kind of a boutique rule for the tour, but it's a good question. But it's simply not covered in 8.1 because it is not a growing or attached natural object. It was a big stone. So
got quite a number of other questions coming in the chat here, so I'm just going to start from the top and work the way down. Asked for clarification about a player removing and then replacing an out of bounds stake.
Yeah, so I won't be able to find the picture off the top of my head necessarily in the slideshow, but if there's an out of bounds, those are treated as those are fixed. You cannot move out of bounds stakes to improve your line of play or even to swing, whatever. So if a player were to go up and there's an out of bounds stake, kind of in the picture ad, if they remove it, right? It used to be in the old rules penalty right away. Now, if before they were to play the ball, someone says, Robert, you can't do that. You can't move the out of bounds stake. I said, okay, thank you. Put it back in. We've recreated that condition. That was one we looked at in 8.1c, I think, where you can recreate the improvement you made and get back to normal. In that case, you're allowed to do it. So if I had made the stroke and then put it back, I'm going to get penalized there, the general penalty, because I can't improve that. I've already played my stroke. So it's one of those things, if you move it out of the way and before you've played it, you put it back, that's going to be fine. And that's a new change and a good change.
Okay. If course maintenance equipment causes damage to fairways with big, muddy tire ruts, would that fit under 8.1D?
Not necessarily. If there's a tire rut, that happens. And in our tournaments, if And this is more of a turning into more of a ground under repair situation, which the rules really, they don't really give much guidance on what is and what is not ground under repair, other than to say that it is decided on by the committee what is ground under repair. It doesn't say literally what it is necessarily. So in that case, if there was a tire rut in the middle of the fairway, it's a perfectly pristine fairway, and then there's a big rut in the middle, the committee would be definitely encouraged, and it would be correct to mark that and say this is an area of ground under repair. Again, we have different things of tire marks. I've seen tire ruts that are barely deep, and it's just simply a track. That's not necessarily ground under repair, if it's way off in the rough somewhere. But again, a big rut right in the middle of the fairway or right around a green, that's transitioning to more of a ground under repair question. So it's not covered in Rule 8 necessarily, and you certainly couldn't repair it. Let's say, so if your ball was behind one of those, you couldn't have, I'm going to fix that. That's protected. The only option would be, okay, well, I'm gonna ask for ground under repair relief by the committee, and they would grant relief. Again, that's when there is a committee present, and let's say it's a tournament or a championship. We have a rules official out there to say, yeah, that's going to be ground under repair.
You just talked about removing out of bounds stakes. I'm going to jump down to Joanne's question here. A pretty quick answer. Can you remove red or yellow stakes, though, is the question. Yeah,
absolutely. And we're going to cover that in Rule 15.2. And I didn't really, I had it when I originally made the presentation. I took it out with what a boundary object is. The white stake is a boundary object. That is defining the parameters of the golf course. So those are fixed. You cannot move those. The red and yellow penalty area stakes, those are obstructions. Those are movable obstructions if you can take them out of the ground, if they're not cemented in. So those you can move. And if your ball moves, you're not going to be penalized. You can put it back. But yeah, you can remove the red, or even if it's 10 feet in front of you and the red stake's kind of in your way, take it down. That's fine. Put it back in the hole when you're done, obviously. But those are totally fine to move. Those are obstructions. The white stakes are very specifically boundary objects that you can't move. That defines the edge of the course. So good question there.
Right. This is another loose impediment question from Neil. Say you're chipping or putting from off the putting green. There is sand that was previously splashed between your ball and the green. What, if anything, can you remove, and how can you remove it?
Yeah, so a good question. So if you're, let's say the group in front of you, right, they made a bunker shot and they deposited a bunch of sand on the putting green and off the putting green, and then you play up and your ball comes around that sand. The sand was there when you played it. So kind of like I talked about earlier, even if your ball is off the putting green, you can go on the putting green and remove that sand. And the avenue by which you can do that can really be anything reasonable, as in, using your hat, your hand, a towel. You'll see a lot of that, getting wiped away. If you watch the Masters, they have guys out there in leaf blowers. I don't think a lot of people have leaf blowers as they play. Won't get into that, but you can move it. And I know the rules used to, I think a long time ago, say you had to remove it in a very specific way. So that's a good question from a holdover. You can remove that sand on the putting green with anything you want. That goes with really any other loose impediment as well. If it's goose dropping, certainly you don't want to do that with your hand. You can use your foot, a towel, your club or whatever. But in removing sand, you can use that towel. Again, if it's that sand that's off the putting green and it was there when your ball came to rest, that you can't touch. So you have to putt through that sand or chip through that sand in the fringe area. But on the putting green, whether your ball's on or off, you can remove that sand. That's totally fine, and you can remove it essentially in any reasonable way like that. Again, for sand, I always use my hat. That's an easy way to kind of blow it around on the putting green and get it out of there. Using your hand's kind of difficult and it's a little messy, so I would recommend using your hat, honestly.
A quick, short follow-up to that is if pebbles are included in that previous sand explosion, can you move those?
Well, this is actually, it happened on tour. I think it was Rory maybe. Yeah, if pebbles are on the putting green, you can always move those. If there's sand and pebbles mixed in and it's in the fringe area, I'm not a geologist necessarily, so a rock's a rock and sand's a sand, and sand. If you can't tell the difference, treat it as sand. If you can look and say this is a rock or a pebble, that's fine. Some bunkers have more than others, but if it's, at some point, sand and rock, there's a blurred line, and I'm not quite sure what that is. So if you can't tell, don't touch it. But if you can clearly see it's a rock, that's totally fine. You can always move that. It's a loose impediment. You can move that. You just can't be moving the sand. So I guess your question boils down to is what is rock and what is sand? again, at a certain level, a small enough rock, I guess, is sand if it's small enough. And again, I'm not a geologist by any means, so I couldn't accurately talk about that. But if you have a question, I would just not touch it and you won't get penalized.
Okay, looks like we have a similar follow-up here. If your competitor splashed sand out after my ball landed on the fringe, I guess then what do we do? Does that change the circumstance?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's covered in 8.1D of restoring a worsened condition. So if my ball is in the fringe area and then behind me, I'm not allowed to mark or move my ball in this point unless it's interfering. So it's not. My ball's in the fringe. Someone behind me, my ball's already there. They play and they deposit a bunch of sand on the putting green and in the fringe, maybe even on my ball. Again, I was entitled to play the course as I found it. And when I found the course, there was no sand between my ball and the putting green. So I had a clear putt. Now there's been sand deposited. So in this case, I could remove that sand. And this is a very limited instance in that 8.1D. I could remove that sand to recreate my original conditions affecting the stroke, which in this case is my line of play, or if it's on my ball, my live ball with the sand around it. So it does depend. The timeline is very important because if I'm hitting into an area and there's already sand there, I can't touch that because that was there when I got it. That's how I'm playing the course as I find it. My ball's there. Again, in your situation, I had a clean line to the hole, a bunch of sand got moved there. I could restore that. And again, using hand, foot, whatever, you just got to be, need to be sure that the sand was deposited after your ball came to rest. Usually, you're standing right there, so you can kind of tell. So.
Okay, next one is an example from tour from 4, 5, 6 years ago. Player chipped his ball up a steep slope, kind of chunked it, made a divot, and started repairing the divot. The ball didn't get back onto the green, rolled back down to where he was. Not sure if it rolled over that divot, but we do recall he was penalized. So maybe just a quick explanation on that.
Yeah, I think that was Camilo Villegas. And I think it happened to Paul Casey at Pebble on the par 5 with the really elevated green. And it actually happened to Ryan Palmer this year in Hawaii, and he didn't get penalized. I say happened to. It didn't get penalized. The situation came up. But again, and this is part of the rule, and I forget which part it is, where it says this: if this happens, where a ball in motion, we're going to kick you to, in this case, 11.3, where it'd say a player could not do any of the prohibited items in 8.1A to affect the ball in motion. So in this case, if the ball's coming down, and this really, it boils down to intent. If I am at that steep slope and I chip it up and I make the divot and I see my ball coming down, I would go over there, and if I'm repairing the pitch mark, in order for my ball to not go back in that pitch mark, that's handled under 11.3 now to be penalized, the general penalty. So in stroke play 2 strokes, for improving that condition affecting the stroke as the ball is moving. If I was unaware, I think that's part of the penalty, right? Or part of the situation. He chips it, makes a divot. He very clearly hit a poor chip, and he just kind of, he in disgust, and he's stamping down his lie, and then he looks up, and then the ball's coming down, and then it rolls in the area. The rule 11.3, there's a word, it says deliberately does that. So in that case, if the player didn't deliberately do it to affect his upcoming condition affecting the stroke, or for a ball in motion, he wouldn't be penalized. So that one's a little hard. Again, with Ryan Palmer's instance at Hawaii, his ball was rolling down and he went over and moved some loose impediments. And Rule 11.3 says you can't alter any of the conditions affected in Rule 8.1A, move a loose impediment, or deliberately move a movable obstruction to affect the ball in motion. So it really hinges on what was the player's intent there. Did they deliberately do it to say, oh, I gotta fix it, that's gonna be a penalty? Or they don't know where the ball's going. They're just like, oh, they're looking down in disgust and fixing it, and then it rolls back in the area. It also not necessarily dependent on if the ball even gets back there. So kind of just to go down this rabbit hole a minute, if I do that and I chip up and the ball's coming back and I'm like, man, I got to fix this going in here. Even if the ball stops short 5-10 feet of where it was, the fact that I deliberately tried to improve a condition in 8.1A to affect the ball in motion, I'm going to be penalized. So whether it rolls there or not, as it's in motion, if I'm because I don't know where the ball is going to be after it's in motion, right? So on the way down, I'm thinking, oh, I got to fix this. Doesn't matter if it stops immediately. I did something deliberately to affect the ball motion. I'm going to be penalized. That was a very long answer. So hopefully I answered your question there. But that one can be interesting, and it does happen on tour a lot because there are a lot of slopes near the green, and they're very finely mown and they're very finely tuned, and there's not a lot of friction there. So the balls are rolling around a lot. And again, you see it about once a year. Again, we saw it a month ago at the Hawaii tournament.
Thanks, Robert. This one's from Beth, a follow-up from the Pebble Beach tournament this weekend. She goes, there were several penalties for the ball moving when the player's club was moving at the same time. Under which rule would that fall?
If Beth, if you're referring to Maverick McNeely, that would be 9.4. If it moves during the player's backstroke, meaning, and I didn't see it all of it necessarily, so you might have seen something I didn't see. But if as I'm during my stroke or the backswing for the stroke, that's covered by 9.1. So it really depends. And I went on to make the stroke. So if a player's swinging and as they're swinging, the ball moves and they go on to make the stroke, 9.1 is going to cover that. But if in Maverick's case, as you're talking about, as long of 5, he grounded his club behind the ball, and the replay and the officials, which is correct, treated the ball as moving, he's going to be penalized and put it back. That's under Rule 9.4, if that's the situation you're talking about, having not seen all of it.
Okay. Here's a quickie. When you're looking for a ball in long grass and you accidentally kick or step on your ball, is there a penalty for this?
No, and this is that's a good question, and it was a good change from 2019. So that's covered by Rule 7.4 if you want to look that up. But if you're searching reasonably, and you accidentally move or step on your ball, and this could be anybody's ball, you're playing with your opponent or fellow competitor or whatever. If you're searching, you accidentally move it. Let's say you're in the tall grass, and the reason you even find the ball is because you feel it under your foot. If it's while searching, which is an action verb, you're searching actively for it, you're not going to be penalized. Replace the ball back. If the lie was altered, you're going to find the nearest, most similar lie and recreate that, and depending, usually it's going to be in tall grass. So you're just going to usually just replace the ball back to where it was. But there's no penalty for that. But again, if you're being careless, if you're in the fairway and you weren't searching for your ball, you knew your ball the player was just being careless. But if you're actively searching, and you can, same thing if you're using your club, you're poking around, kind of looking, oh, I moved my ball with my club, put it back, no penalty.
All right, this looks like the last one in the chat for now anyways, and it's another follow-up to our discussion about removing the sand on the putting green. After your ball has come to rest, I believe is the situation we're talking about here. And the question is, can the sand be swiped away with a towel, or must it be carefully taken away with your hand since it's off of the putting surface?
So yeah, assuming we're operating under 8.1D and your ball was there, someone else deposited sand on your ball playing out of the bunker, worsened your line of play, conditions affecting the stroke, you are allowed to move the sand and restore the conditions in your line of play. The rules aren't very specific with, again, what you need to use. Again, a towel or hat of your hand is fine to restore it. You need to be careful. If you move your ball in that case, you're not going to be penalized because there's in 9.4B exception 4, it's while applying a rule. If you want to look that one up, you're not going to be penalized. And there's one of the bullet points. There's 5 bullet points there. It says, if when restoring worsened conditions, you accidentally move your ball. So if you're using your towel and you haphazardly hit your ball, you're going to put it back, no penalty. But again, there's no mode of cleaning necessarily that's prohibited. Maybe using like a leaf blower or something unreasonable, maybe, but hat or towel or hand, it's all the same.
No more questions in the chat. Unless someone wants to speak up, go ahead and unmute yourself. We can answer anything else you have. But
yeah, if you just want to talk, that's fine too. It's a little easier sometimes, I understand.
Robert, that last scenario you just explained when you said wiping the fringe with a towel could potentially move your ball. In that case, if the player splashed sand onto my ball, I'm not allowed to mark it, lift it, clean the ball, and then place it back.
Certainly. You could do that. That's because there's in that rule, there's in 8.1D, there's 3 bullet points. Is you can do this, this, or this. And it's whatever really suits the situation. So when I was explaining it there, it sounded like the question was about specifically using a towel to move it. You know, if your ball, if you know, you've got your ball, right, and there's sand on top of it, you can certainly mark, lift, you know, remove the sand that was deposited on there and place it back. So it's very dependent on what the restoration of conditions look like. But in that very specific instance, I just think they were asking if they could use a towel to move it. But you can do that. That's, again, when you look at that, and there's a bullet point that says you can mark the spot of the ball, lift and clean and replace the ball on its original spot if it is reasonable to do so to restore the original conditions, if material ended up on the ball when the conditions were worsened. So that's 8.1D1, the second bullet point. If that, does that help?
Yep.
Okay, cool. Any other questions anybody wants to open their mic on for? Cool. Ashley, any in the chat box or anything?
Nothing else, just lots of accolades and thank yous.
Cool. Well, glad everybody hopefully enjoyed it. Again, this is something we're going to post online. So if you ever need a refresher on Rule 8, here it is. You can come back and look at it. If you have a friend who needs a refresher on Rule 8, you can send it to them and say, see, this is what the rule means, and this is a situation we were talking about. I get that a lot where it's like, oh, that happened to me, my buddy, a year ago, and you know, we talked about it in a rules seminar. They'll ask it pointedly, and so this will be cataloged here. And again, you know, you found the link somehow, and it's on our rules page. So on that, we've got, you know, 10 more Mondays. We're going to do this, and next week it's going to be Rule 9, which is another big rule. That's, you know, a cornerstone rule. And that's got a lot going on too. So next week will be a lot of information in that one. So I appreciate everyone being here again. If you've got any comments, concerns, constructive criticism, whatever, this is brand new. We're trying this out, and again, hopefully people enjoy it, and we can keep growing it and use it as the means. You know, in Colorado, I don't know if everyone's here, but in Colorado, we're certainly not in Gulf weather. It's very cold, it's in the negative. So you know, it's a good winter activity for us, and something to have fun with. So there's no other questions. We'll shut it down, and then you know, my email is on the website if you ever have any questions or anything. But we'll be back again next Monday at 9 and cover Rule 9. So thanks everybody for coming out.